Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into something pretty massive, the architecture of power. More specifically, we're going to be decoding the complexities of Brazilian federalism. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly does a vast, incredibly diverse nation prevent absolute power from concentrating in the hands of just a few people? Well, the answer actually lies in its structural design. We're going to examine the formal mechanics that try to balance a unified national identity with regional independence. So let's dive right in. Here's a quick look at our roadmap. First, we'll cover what federalism actually is. Second, the two different paths of the US versus Brazil. Third, how power and resources are divided. Fourth, the role of the Supreme Court. Fifth, the centralization dilemma. And finally, the future of the Federation. All right, block one. What is federalism? To really understand this, we need to turn to the critical vocabulary of legal scholar Dalmo D'Abrio Dolari. He defines federalism fundamentally as an indissoluble alliance of states based on a constitution. So it forms a new unified state, but, and this is absolutely crucial, the member states within it retain their own autonomy and their own specific competencies. In everyday terms, federalism is basically a highly sophisticated balancing act. It's a system designed to harmonize national unity with regional independence. It ensures that local populations have a real voice in their day-to-day governance, all while participating in a much larger national project. Moving right along to block two paths, the US versus Brazil. There's actually a really stark contrast in how these two major federations came to be. The US model is what we call centripetal, meaning it moved from the outside in. You had independent, sovereign states that voluntarily united to form a new central government. They literally gave up a piece of their power to create the union. But the Brazilian model, it's centrifugal. It moved from the inside out. Brazil actually started as a highly centralized unitary empire. In order to maintain control over such a massive territory and respond to growing regional demands, the central power essentially had to break apart and push power outwards to its provinces. This fundamental difference in origin, coming together versus breaking apart, leaves a lasting imprint on how power is distributed and even perceived today. Drawing from the analysis of scholar Luis Roberto Barroso, we can trace how this centrifugal origin has played out over the years. In 1889, the First Republic formally established the Federation. However, that decentralized ideal was basically crushed in 1937. We saw extreme centralization under the authoritarian Estado Novo regime. Then, following redemocratization in 1946, Federalist principles made a comeback, but only to face challenges again during later authoritarian periods. Finally, we arrive at the 1988 Constitution, which solidified the modern federal structure we have today. The main takeaway here is that federalism in Brazil isn't just some static rulebook. It's much more like a historical pendulum, constantly swinging back and forth between democracy and authoritarianism, between decentralization and centralization. Okay, block 3, dividing power and resources. So the Brazilian Federation basically operates on 3 distinct tiers. First, you have the union, or the federal government, which controls the big picture items. We're talking the national economy, the currency, and broad overarching legislation. Next, you have the states, which handle regional administration and specific local laws. But here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike a lot of other federations where cities are just administrative subdivisions of the states, Brazilian municipalities are formally recognized as fundamental, autonomous components of the federation itself. They carry their own political weight and are tasked with addressing the immediate day-to-day needs of their communities. But let's be real for a second. Legal autonomy means absolutely nothing without financial autonomy. And right now, the union holds a massive economic advantage. They control the currency, they manage inflation, and they collect the lion's share of the major tax revenues. Meanwhile, the states and municipalities are kind of stuck in a state of financial dependence. They rely heavily on specific taxes like the ICMS, which is essentially a tax on goods and services, and crucially, they rely on massive financial transfers from the federal government. Scholars emphasize that this financial imbalance creates a dynamic where the central government can essentially exert immense political pressure just by holding the purse strings. Now, this inherent imbalance naturally leads to a bit of friction. So I want to pose this critical question. When the union and the states inevitably disagree over the boundaries of their power, who decides? Who exactly acts as the referee in this incredibly complex game? That brings us to block 4, the Supreme Court's role. One of the absolute primary tools the Supreme Court uses to referee this game is known as the principle of symmetry. Now let's translate that out of legalese for a second. Symmetry is a legal doctrine demanding that member states structure their governments, their laws, and their state constitutions in exact alignment with the federal blueprint. In other words, Yes, states have the autonomy to make local decisions, but the actual architectural frame of their government, how their branches interact, how their elections are run, has to mirror the federal model perfectly. They literally cannot invent entirely new, customized systems of governance. When researchers analyze the court's decisions since 1988, they find that it's frequently called upon to resolve disputes over these exact structural boundaries. The court is constantly drawing lines in the sand, firmly demarcating where state autonomy ends and federal supremacy begins. They do this to ensure that governors and state legislatures don't deviate from that standardized federal script. For the average citizen, what this really means is that local governments are heavily restricted in how they can innovate or experiment with their own democratic structures. Let's move on to Block 5, the centralization dilemma. As scholar Luis Roberto Barroso points out, because the union has this supreme overriding control over the economy, banking, and currency issuance, it actually creates what he calls economic distortions. This immense financial gravity naturally pulls power away from the states and toward the center. Think about it. When states inevitably run deficits and require federal bailouts or specific funding grants, they often have to surrender a degree of their political autonomy in exchange. It creates this very real structural cycle of dependence that slowly erodes regional independence over time. This dynamic leads to a truly fascinating paradox, the conflict between formal versus real federalism. On paper, right, in a strict, formal, constitutional sense, Brazil is a beautifully decentralized federation of autonomous states. But in reality, due to those economic imbalances and historical tendencies we've been discussing, the country very often operates with a highly centralizing structure. Scholars point out that this centralization can sometimes directly contradict the true democratic autonomy that local populations are theoretically supposed to enjoy under a federal system. And empirical research into this dilemma absolutely confirms these observations. Studies looking at the Supreme Court's behavior reveal a clearly restrictive posture when it comes to a state's ability to self-organize. The court leans heavily on that principle of symmetry we defined earlier to shut down any state deviations from the federal norm. Objectively speaking, both the historical and the judicial trends in Brazil lean heavily toward promoting and maintaining centralization rather than expanding the boundaries of state autonomy. The entire architecture as it stands heavily favors the center. Finally, let's look at Block 6, Future of the Federation. I want to highlight this really profound insight derived from our academic sources today. It says, the federal state is a system in constant tension, balancing factors of convergence and also contradictions. I think this is absolutely essential to remember. The friction we see between the union and the states, the constant arguments over funding, the endless Supreme Court cases, none of these are glitches in the system. They are literally built-in features of the architecture. Federalism isn't meant to be perfectly still or perfectly peaceful. It's a dynamic, living system of constant push and pull between the need for a unified nation and the very real demands of a diverse population. So, I'm going to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As society evolves and as global economies shift, how will this incredibly delicate architecture of power continue to balance that overarching demand for national unity with the absolutely vital need for local autonomy? Understanding these underlying rules is pretty much crucial for understanding how any society manages to govern itself without falling apart. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer as we decoded Brazilian federalism. Keep learning, keep questioning the systems around you, and I'll catch you next time.